Welcome, guys, to the first episode of the Muscle by Brain podcast with JPS and Lifting for Life. Myself and Sir Ian McCarthy will be hosting this weekly podcast for everything you need to know in regards to evidence-based training for lifting, physique development, and bodybuilding. Welcome, Ian.
Thanks so much. Happy to be here.
And on today's episode, Ian and I will be discussing in-depth progressive overload for bodybuilders. And obviously that translates to those who are interested in maximal muscle growth. And we're going to take an in-depth look at the mechanisms of hypertrophy, recovery, training volume, and as well as program design and progressive overload, and how that best applies to training for muscle growth. Ian, how are you, my friend?
Doing well. How are you?
I'm very well.
I'm really excited to explain to people why they shouldn't lift. You know, it doesn't work, or they shouldn't progressively overload.
Just lift. So today we're going to talk about progressive overload for bodybuilders, and let's first talk about the goal of bodybuilders. It's to build the body and to build muscle, and the exact adaptation that bodybuilders wish to make is indeed hypertrophy. So we needed to talk about everything related to hypertrophy and how we build muscle over time. So let's kick off the discussion and talk about hypertrophy in a physiological sense. And do you want to explain to the guys what hypertrophy is at a fundamental level?
Yeah, it's chronic positive muscle protein balance. So muscle protein synthesis exceeds muscle protein breakdown. And if that occurs at any point in time, then the result is muscle gain. But if that occurs for, let's say, a 60-minute period, one wouldn't say you're gaining muscle. You're not gaining muscle at the level of the whole body or the individual. A term you'll sometimes see is like phenotypic hypertrophy. So there's a distinction between that which is occurring at some time point on a mechanistic level and that which occurs at the whole body scale. Yeah. But I think one can reasonably reduce it to that. I think there are a great number of things that go into this that we'll discuss. But yeah, it's chronic positive muscle protein balance. You can't have that and not have the accumulation of additional literally amino acids in muscle. And the result is you have more contractile tissue, and the eventual result is you have visibly larger muscles.
Yeah, for sure. And lifting weights is one of the primary means of increasing muscle protein synthesis and that positive adaptation. But it isn't as simple as just lifting and getting bigger over time. As we know, when we become intermediates and advanced lifters, things start to change. We need to understand the mechanisms behind hypertrophy so that we can maximize our training and program design to ensure we're doing everything to progressively increase muscle protein synthesis over time. So do you want to talk about the mechanisms of hypertrophy that the research that Brad Schoenfeld and James Krieger have been doing has shown to be important for program design?
Absolutely. And I first want to note that, in thinking about this topic, because obviously we spoke about it prior to just hopping on, that would be an interesting approach to a podcast. But I think it's very important that I speak very frankly and say that I don't regard myself as an expert on the mechanisms. Really, and I take responsibility for that in some sense, because when it comes down to that which I have selected to read, it has overwhelmingly been applied research. You'll often hear the term training studies. So the difference between, and obviously there are many different types of studies. You know, even if you were to just say training study, that doesn't mean one is like another. Correct. Mechanistic research, that doesn't mean one is like another. You might have something that literally only looks at a mechanism, but then you might have another one that is closer to being in the real world. And then you have something that really looks at hypertrophy. But I primarily look at, you know, subjects did the following training protocol for 8 or 10 or 12 weeks. And there's maybe a nutrient related intervention. You know, do we give them protein before or after training? Volume might be manipulated. You might have two groups using different loads, etc. And the reason why I've done that is, you know, simply because it's more pragmatic. It relates more directly to what we do in practice. So when it comes to really digging into the mechanisms, that would be a question that um, I don't feel effectively able to answer. I mean, that's what people with PhDs study for.
Correct.
Lifetimes in some cases. Now, what you mentioned Brad and James, and what Brad and James have done is meta-analyses on frequency and volume. And it's interesting that you went there, because that's what I was thinking about, is when we talk about hypertrophy and what causes hypertrophy. So it's a perfectly legitimate, grammatically correct, intelligible question. What I find interesting about it is I feel you can answer it in multiple different ways that are all correct. So you asked the question initially, and I answered it with exactly. You asked the question initially, and I answered it in terms of muscle protein balance, really because that's the answer that came to mind initially, and that's an answer which I think helps clarify what's going on to people who might be really fixated on hormones or something, and again, on some level it is muscle protein synthesis exceeds breakdown, and that just keeps happening, and then you gain muscle. But you could also come at it from, you could talk about anabolic hormones. That isn't something that doesn't matter. You could talk about mTOR. That isn't something that doesn't matter. And these, I don't view these as mutually exclusive accounts of hypertrophy. It's accounting for hypertrophy on different levels. And then really everything I've said so far has been more mechanistic. And again, what Brad and James have done, and others, is look at interventions and the effects of different interventions. Exactly. So we can talk about hypertrophy in terms of training volume, in terms of intensity, which is usually understood to mean load relative to a 1 rep max, and training frequency, and all of these things matter. So to simplify it on the training side, I would say what is established beyond a reasonable doubt is, and I don't want to imply that if there's disagreement that necessarily someone is unreasonable, but I think I'll put it this way. If someone told me you need to argue against the following positions, I would be like, I'll probably decline that invitation, because we look at volume and frequency, and it's overwhelmingly likely to be the case that with volume being the same 2 times a week, training a muscle twice a week or more often is better than once a week. And I would reiterate, that is assuming you do the same work. It's same work, differently distributed. You make better gains. That's very significant. I mean, that's a huge, and within the evidence-based community, I think a lot of people are like, no kidding, this isn't even something to talk about. But I think even if you look at the literature on this, there's studies where every single subject prior to being a part of the study was doing a bro split. I still think that's the default. Then on the volume end, what we see is, as you scale up weekly training volume, and by the way, volume is defined in multiple different ways, and we can get into that, because I think with different definitions being used concurrently, confusion can result. In terms of weekly working sets, when you move someone from what I would call a low volume to what's probably a moderate volume. So I think, if I recall correctly, these studies were separated into something like 1 to 5 working sets a week, or it might have been 1 to 4, and then 5 to 9, and then 10 or more. And within that analysis, which didn't account for it didn't differentiate between 10 and 12 and 12 and 15 and 15 20 and so on. It shows that more volume is better, with diminishing returns that I think we could speculate would be additionally diminishing above that. But very simply, at least to some point, higher frequency results in better hypertrophy, and at least to some point, greater volume, in that case defined as number of working sets per week, yields greater hypertrophy. And I think even those two very basic statements there are probably a lot of people who would benefit from hearing that and from really understanding that and applying it.
Yeah, for sure. And in terms of Brad's research looking at mechanical stress, metabolic stress, and muscle damage, where do those 3 components of hypertrophy fit in within program design to achieve that volume and frequency?
Absolutely. I think it's interesting you ask that, as I've been thinking about really wondering how much these actually influence program design. What I find is if we first of all, so really backing up, for a significant period of time, I more or less regurgitated this view of mechanical tension, metabolic stress, muscle damage. Okay, this is what drives hypertrophy. And at some point, I kind of went, I don't know this to be the case. So I've grown more skeptical of them, particularly metabolic stress and muscle damage, and that's also something we could get into. But what struck me is that I think appropriate program design covers all your bases, and
they become inherent. Yeah,
right, exactly. And there's also a pragmatic aspect of being willing to, the phrase that comes to mind is open up your programming. In other words, include more in what you do.
Variety, yeah.
But potentially without very clearly good reason, but with the thought being better safe than sorry, address all potential benefit. And an example would be training through a variety of rep ranges.
Yeah.
I actually haven't seen what I would regard as this is something that's being studied more. There's emerging evidence, but I wouldn't say that it's apparent in the way, say, higher frequency is clearly beneficial, et cetera, that training through a variety of rep ranges is actually superior to training. I mean, it could literally be like a certain number of reps, assuming equal volume. But again, coming at it from a pragmatic perspective in terms of what you do with programming, I really struggle to imagine writing a program where, like, even if someone gave me the assignment of just make it one rep range, it's difficult. You would be deliberately putting yourself in a corner.
It's far less enjoyable as well.
Oh, definitely. I mean,
and adherence is a massive issue for longevity, which is super critical for maximizing your muscle growth. You need to be doing this for a long time.
I absolutely agree. And there are a huge number of things that go into this. I've been thinking about it primarily from the perspective of physiology, but even just things like when it comes to rep ranges, I'll speak to this a little more, but briefly, because it's not the primary topic of this discussion. But what's really struck me about rep ranges about 2 years ago now is when it comes to programming, it's really exercise specific.
Oh, 100%.
So to a very, very large extent, I'm not thinking about mechanical tension. I'm not thinking about metabolic stress. I'm thinking about the fact that at least within the scope of hypertrophy, frankly, I think I would be a moron to tell someone to do a 20 rep squat. Now, I understand people do it to challenge themselves. And if, let's say someone wants to get better at a 20 rep squat for whatever reason, they might just genuinely want to do that. Well, then doing that makes sense. But from a hypertrophy perspective, it's like, why? Do heavy squats and then go do, if you desire to do that, and I think it would be appropriate, depending on context, go and do a 15 or 20 or 25 or 30 rep knee extension set over here, where you're not absolutely annihilating your cardiovascular system and risking form breakdown and all of this. And notice how I didn't say anything about mechanical tension there. That's just very practical.
It's inherent. Yeah.
Different exercises are appropriate for different rep ranges. So that was probably not a great answer to the question of how those fit in with programming. Beyond, it's probably actually limited.
Exercise selection dependent, for sure.
Yeah, like when it comes to sitting down and actually designing a program for someone, it's the degree to which these clearly directly impact that, as opposed to being a piece of knowledge along with many, 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 many other things is, I think, very limited.
It's far more tangible when you look at the program variables and exercise selection and how to obviously design it accordingly, as opposed to looking at these mechanisms, because it becomes much more, as I said, intangible. You can't really do anything with that information in the gym.
Precisely. So I think a lot about number of working sets in a workout, on every level, per exercise, total for a body part in a workout over a week, wanting these things to be appropriate for the individual, for their goals, and so on. Frequency is certainly, I think about it a lot. Frequency is something where you figure out what it just set, and then you go from there. It's like a 15-second analysis. And similarly, going back to intensity, that's something which is a lot to do with just the exercise that's being done.
For sure. And you speak of these variables, and they are the bread and butter of program design, in the sense that they are going to be driving the primary adaptation that we want to be making. And training volume, as you mentioned, has obviously been shown in the research to be the primary driver of muscle growth. And you can't talk about one of the variables without the others, which I think is extremely important for listeners to understand from the onset. But let's talk about that intricate relationship and how that is affected by the following scenarios: training age, experience being part of training age, your individual response to training, such as those people who get wiped out easily versus those who have a greater work capacity, and weak points. So how does frequency, volume, and intensity affect those scenarios, and how do they relate to each other?
Absolutely. So let's start with volume. I think it's perhaps the most straightforward. With someone who's completely untrained, the amount of volume required to generate a desirable outcome is extremely minimal. I mean, I would be really curious to see, but I think that I've actually seen research on this where untrained subjects did one set of knee extensions to failure, and that generated hypertrophy. This is kind of stretched. Like, I haven't looked at that recently, but again, if you were to take someone completely untrained and have them, let's say, train a muscle 3 days a week with one really hard set per workout, that would work. And as someone becomes more advanced, they need additional volume to continue making progress. To continue making progress at all, and their progress is going to be slower over time. So it becomes harder to make worse progress. And so, the result is you increase volume. Well, it really depends on your perspective on this. One perspective would be as aggressive as you can be with volume and just do that always. And one would be start out with very little, that's effective, and it's even more nuanced than that. There's a period in which resistance training is highly damaging to muscle. And interestingly, we know this is a study that came out last year that was fascinating. Came out of, oh gosh, I can't remember the author, but they looked at muscle protein synthesis comparing it to hypertrophy and looking at the correlation, and they found that there's a strong correlation, but only after someone is used to training and the muscle damage that results from it is diminished. So it really happens. Take a novice, very damaging, minimal hypertrophy results. They get used to it, and then you have this delayed hypertrophy that kicks in. So,
and that's due to the neural adaptations that occur for beginners. It's primarily a skill acquisition in the onset, and then those muscle adaptations start to catch up once they're neurally adapted.
In terms of what you see, like in terms of how progress is made, yes. And then as the body adapts to resistance training in terms of the muscle damage that results is mitigated, then you see more hypertrophy, which is on the level of the individual. You see more hypertrophy, and then mechanistically you see a greater correlation between muscle protein synthesis and actual hypertrophy, as opposed to muscle protein synthesis happening, but mostly being directed toward just repairing damage. Now, going back to the volume question, again, one perspective would be just always be as aggressive as you can be, and another would say be very, very modest initially, and then scale it up over time so that the individual is continuously making progress, and you're never doing, for lack of a better term, superfluous volume, more volume than you need to make progress. But again, I think if we were to reduce this to a basic statement that is generally the case, I would say greater volume over time. Similarly with frequency, it appears that the anabolic window, the period after training in which muscle protein synthesis is elevated, that might even be a slight misstatement. What we really mean is the period after training in which maximal possible muscle protein balance is greater. So, assuming that you provide the amino acids that would be necessary and so on, the total muscle protein balance for that period is higher as a result of ever seen. I think it's been 72 hours, and that does appear to shorten in trained individuals. And so and this gets into the fairly controversial area of should we even use this should we consider this? If we should, I think everyone would acknowledge we should consider it, but the question would be, how much significance should we assign to it?
Yeah.
I would say a decent amount, but we need to consider other things as well. But this would at least be suggestive of desiring higher training frequencies for people as they become more advanced. Those are the two things that are obvious to me. I would note that with regard to intensity, my primary concern here would actually be pragmatic. I feel like I keep coming back to practical stuff, but true beginners, I wouldn't have them do high intensity work. Really from one perspective would be, are they even able to do it? Are they skilled enough to do it? Yeah. And then, which ties into safety and concerns of whether they're able to do it safely. There you go. Sorry, perfect. That was a really awkward ending to the sentence. It sounded like
There we go. No, but that covers a lot, because I think it's super important to give context to these discussions about training volume, because people talk about, yes, more volume, 10 sets, but they don't take into consideration their training age and experience or their own individual response, because a lot of people, who are very responsive to, the stimulus of lifting weights, do not need anywhere near as much as, others who are not.
Right.
And these are
Could I just speak to that point? Because, by the way, I apologize for interrupting, because you asked about it and then I dropped it. So with regard to individual responses, I have two immediate thoughts. One is, I think it's fairly tough to discern this. And here's what I mean. I mean, it's one thing if someone doesn't train, they start training, let's say very unintelligently, they just do whatever the stereotypical bro thing is, and they gain like 50 pounds of muscle. Okay, so it's very apparent this person has really good genetics for muscle building. But that's, I want to say, a fairly extreme example. When it comes to discerning things like the exact amount or even a pretty narrow range of volume or frequency that you respond best to, I do, on the one hand, I do feel one can discern that, but I think it's a continuous process. And I've been training for almost 10 years. I started training in January 2008, and I feel that I almost have like a decent sense of what the right frequency is and volume and all of this. So I guess what I'm saying is, you need to don't think that you can do this after 6 months of training, or if you're working with someone, don't think that you're going to figure it out really quickly. I mean, it requires an extreme degree of trial and error, but on a more positive note, I do think that this should probably be the primary driver of what you do in practice.
Yeah.
So, and you can come up with extreme examples, but here's an easy example. I'll actually talk about a real person, not remotely as a criticism, but just let's talk about a real case. Jeff Alberts. He has even acknowledged that he trains in a manner that some people would call training for a novice. I think at this point he trains 3 or 4 days a week. And from what I have seen, and if I'm incorrect, someone tell me, like, there's no intention of misrepresenting anything here. he does a handful of really good working sets per body part per workout with like once or twice a week frequency depending. And if we were to come at this just from the perspective of what did those meta-analyses say, we would say, well, he should do more. He'll get better gains.
Yeah.
Well, the reality of the situation is he's been lifting for, I think, over 30 years. So if he says, look, if I do more, I won't be able to recover, that's probably weightier than the meta-analysis. Because again, like there was probably a point at which he did. I mean, who knows? Like there might even have been a period in which he like trained really aggressively, like high volume, 6 days a week training, hitting everything 3 days a week or whatever it might be, and worked really well for him for 4 days, and then fifth workout he couldn't even do it. So and again, I think in practice you have to remain very skeptical because there's such a risk of drawing false conclusions, and that is an advantage of science. Is, as an example, the ability to very accurately measure muscle thickness, which we're not going to do in practice. And so there's a reliability of the results in that way that you don't have in practice. But what you have in terms of your personal experience is the 5 years or 12 or 28 of actually doing it. You know what a really high volume workout feels like. You know how you feel when you eat 4,000 calories a week and you train 7 days a week. You feel absolutely amazing. Oh, so you should do that. This other time you were eating like very little and training less, and you felt worse and you looked a lot worse. So you're someone who responds well to a lot of food and a lot of training and a lot of frequency. And so you can learn a huge amount from that.
And I think that's so important for anyone listening to realize is that the science just guides our starting point. And from there, we need to then look at how we're responding. And instead of then always continuing to look at the research for the answers, whilst that's important, we really need to be paying attention to, are we progressing in the right manner? And are we actually getting bigger and responding well to what we're doing?
Absolutely. And would you mind if I spoke to that point for 3 to 5 minutes, even though it's...
Go nuts. Let loose, Ian.
Because I really appreciate it. And the reason why is the reason why I want to talk about this is because I think this is a hugely important issue and one about which at least some people seem to be mistaken, in my opinion. And that is the perceived conflict between science and experience. That's usually the phrase you see, science versus experience, something like this. I simply do not buy that there is an inherent conflict here.
No.
Indeed, even when there seems to be a practical conflict, I don't think this is a limitation of the scientific method or something, or literally the scientific research itself is shit. Now, certainly there is bad scientific research, there's fraudulent research and so on, but what I really think it comes down to is we as human beings just haven't figured out what the compatibility is yet. And that isn't just some philosophical assumption I've made. I think it's easy to give examples. I mean, let's say that you have a study which says such and such training frequency results in better gains. And I'm realizing this isn't going to be the best illustration, but let's say that you have someone who, when they started training, they went immediately into evidence-based training. Like the day that they started lifting, they were exposed to folks like Eric Helms, Alan Aragon, and they immediately went in. Yeah, and I know of one person who he read a lot of scientific literature relating to lifting before he even started lifting.
Wow.
Because he wanted to know what he was doing before he started. So let's say that you take someone like that and they do everything quote right, meaning in line with the available scientific evidence. And they make decent gains for 5 years. And then after 5 years, they just throw all of that out and they start doing radical bro splits. They train everything once a week. They do 30 sets and they make much better gains. So a plausible immediate response is, there's a comment here. Like, what is the deal? The science is wrong. What's going on? Well, the deal is that we're, in the one case, we are talking about average results.
Correct.
And in the other case, we are talking about one person's response. Whereas I don't know this to be the case. And I mean, there are even studies which don't report individual subject data. So someone on the outside looking in couldn't find this out. But let's assume that we had all of the data from every single subject in all of these studies. I would be completely willing to acknowledge that, and because I say that as someone who's probably more on the high frequency side. If you were to put everyone on the continuum, yeah, I'm sure you can find someone who you could find. You know what? This is actually this really happened. And I reiterate that if I'm wrong about this, someone tell me. But I'm like 98% sure of this. The study that came out recently, published by Alan Aragon, Brad Schoenfeld, the protein timing study, comparing pre and post workout protein timing. There were subjects that lost muscle thickness.
Wow.
And this was a training study. So they did 8 weeks of resistance training supervised by research assistants. So they weren't not training. They weren't doing, and if I recall correctly, they were probably doing 3 days a week full body. I think that's the kind of the standard in those studies.
Yeah.
So in fact, I'm pretty sure they were doing 3 days a week full body training, instituting progressive overload when possible. And it's even displayed graphically. There are subjects that lost muscle thickness in at least some muscles. That just happened. They were lifting the whole time. They were doing the right things. They were being given the protein shake. Maybe
there's
even the anabolic.
So many other factors that come into play, like life stresses, sleep, all the rest of it.
Totally. And again, I would reiterate that I don't think this means, let's talk about that study, because again, that's a real example.
Very interesting.
I don't think it means lifting weights doesn't work, full body training is crap. My best guess, and again, I acknowledge I'm kind of stretching my memory on this one, but I remember reading, when I saw that, I was like, my intuition was their training volume was probably higher beforehand and it came down. Like what they did in the study was less than they were doing prior. I think that's a very plausible explanation. And so that reiterates the point that we as people just need to figure out how the pieces fit together, as opposed to saying the puzzle is shit, like the manufacturer screwed it up and they don't fit, right?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And moving on to one of the most important topics when we talk about volume specifically is the theoretical model that Mike Israetel has devised in terms of our maximum recoverable volume, our max adaptive volume, and then the minimum effective dose. Now, there's only so much volume that obviously each individual can do before they overreach, and there's an amount of volume that they positively adapt to, as well as a minimum effective dose. Can you elaborate on how this fits within everything we've spoken about?
Yes, my take on these concepts is I think they're totally legitimate.
Because this is another level. This is another level to the whole hypertrophy equation. Right.
I think they exist. I mean, to start with a very basic proposition. So certainly, I say this because I'm not sure what the term would be, but for lack of a better one, a skeptic as to the significance of these concepts in practice. So I would say, I would first happily grant there is such a thing as the maximum amount of volume that you can recover from. Above that, you're not able to recover, and then you accumulate fatigue, and at some point, you're not able to perform.
Yeah.
I guess by definition, that if you go above your MRV, you're then not able to perform in the same way. That's how it's defined. Similarly, minimum effective dose, I think that's very straightforward. Now, I think there's some nuance there. I think the people, kind of getting ahead of myself, I would say the people who are regarded as minimum effective dose people, Eric Helms probably being the most prominent example. I don't think he believes that a person should do literally the minimum amount that produces any positive adaptation. It's something more like they want to do this, they want to gain muscle to be able to be bigger on a bodybuilding stage. This is the amount of volume that I think will produce that. So that's what they should do. Even if maybe they could do more, they should just do what works. Which is different than the literal minimum amount of volume that produces any adaptation. And then maximum adaptive volume. Sure, I would acknowledge that this is, at least by definition, different than maximum recoverable volume, because maximum recoverable volume literally just is the maximum amount of volume from which you can recover, and it doesn't say anything about adaptation. So I mentioned that I'm a skeptic. So I guess what has struck me is, after having been exposed to these concepts and again acknowledging that they exist, I don't think I fundamentally changed the way I program. I think that there are practical issues with using these concepts for program design, and that I've raised in the past. Things like, how do you really know where this is? Probably my fundamental thought or reason why I don't find myself using MRV is I don't really think that's the reason why people don't do more volume. I think it's more, especially when it's talked about on a body part level of what your maximum recoverable volume. I think you can almost always get more volume in for a body part somewhere. And the reasons why you don't are things like time and energy constraints, needing to train and as opposed to it being as simple as that body part isn't able to recover. Indeed, I wouldn't go as far as to say that there's no such thing as overtraining
Sorry, Ian, you just cut there. You said there was no such thing as...
Oh, I said I wouldn't go as far as to say there's no such thing as overtraining a muscle, but I don't think that recovery of an individual muscle is typically the reason why you don't do more volume. I would acknowledge that there are muscles which, in my experience, seem more sensitive in terms of recovery. So an example which comes to mind is the pecs. I think that is closer to being one where the reason you don't do more is because it can't recover. But even then, the skeptic in me says, can you really not do another set of cable flies somewhere and still recover from that? And then if you're able to do, can you even then add another set? And so again, these are practical objections to this, I would say.
And I think when you start thinking like this, you become less dogmatic in your program design itself, because obviously a lot of people get stuck in their ways, upper body, lower body, push, pull, legs, and, programming like this. But when you understand these concepts and theories like you're demonstrating now, you realize that you can piece together the puzzle and have your volume, spread out in a manner which almost increases your maximum recoverable volume because it's far more intelligent.
Yeah, I think something else about which I've just been thinking a lot recently is that to a large extent, I don't think whether it's different accounts of hypertrophy or different, meaning looking at mechanisms, what causes it, or different accounts of the role of progression, different accounts of the role of volume. To a large extent, I find that they aren't mutually exclusive. Rather, I almost come at it from the perspective of okay, let's talk about what seems to be clearly wrong, and then kind of move from there. So to speak about MRV, so much of what I've said so far is essentially critical. So a couple of things to consider here from a positive perspective. And this, like, I'm doing this for two reasons. One, I want to be balanced, and two, I literally just think it's true. Like, I want to make things up for the sake of wanting to give a perceived balanced presentation. But MRV, Mike has said that it started out as athletes were killing themselves, and they're going like they're just wiping themselves out. And I wonder how often this is the case within bodybuilding circles. I mean, it definitely happens, but I think there's been a move toward, like, kind of look at what bodybuilders do now. It's high volume, but it's low frequency. A lot of cable stuff, a lot of machine stuff, a lot of high rep stuff. I think maybe an argument for that training is that it doesn't strike me as super recovery intensive. But with regard to MRV, and people generally, in principle, you shouldn't do that more than that from which you can recover. I think that's a good starting point. I would also if we were to simplify it to, if you're able to do more volume and recover from it and adapt to it, then you should do it to maximize beneficial outcomes. I think that's true. I think it's worth saying. And that's completely, I don't say this to be deflationary, but that I think is completely uncontroversial. If you're, I say that, but then then you still do have to account for things like diminishing marginal returns. What if you're able to do 4 more sets over here, but the additional adaptation is 3%? And so, ironically, and this wasn't my intent, I've found myself coming back to reasons why I don't use MRV in wanting to articulate ways in which I agree with it. So, I tried.
It's very interesting because these concepts are fundamentally true, but in terms of what we do in reality, they can simply just guide, and provide an awareness as to how we're responding to training. Really, that's in essence all they can do. And I think it's also important to note to listeners that MRV was derived from sport, where performance is the goal, versus bodybuilding, where performance is far less of a proxy, for overall development. Volume is the best metric to use as opposed to how you're performing per se. So I think that's important to note. And something else which I'd like your take on, Ian, is as we become more advanced, I've heard Mike talk about it becomes like walking a tightrope between what our maximum adaptive volume and the maximum amount we can recover from. The gap between them gets much closer the more experienced we are as a lifter, meaning that we're at a much greater risk of overreaching when we're experienced because we have to do more as a result of what you were saying, diminishing returns. Let's discuss that.
Sure. So one thing I want to note initially, and I think, okay, I made a comment. I'll back up even more. This is very discombobulated. There was a discussion on Facebook.
Discombobulated.
In one of these, in one of the evidence-based Facebook groups, there was a discussion about increasing MRV, and I only made one comment in the discussion because it was something that I saw briefly, and I saw a comment and I was interested, and I commented, and I don't know where it went from there. But I said, I'm not really sure that MRV actually increases with experience. I'm willing to be convinced, but that doesn't. It seems to be. It's something you can manipulate.
I think for sure it has to be logically, in terms of as we age, and sarcopenia and just all the physiological changes as we get older. It almost makes sense that you can't just keep doing more forever. There's got to be this, tipping point at some point in time, and we could use Jeff Alberts as an example, like you were saying.
Right. So I think I might want to put it as a question of why would additional training experience. Okay, so let's put it this way. The more you train, the longer you train, assuming that you're training appropriately, you get better at it. You get whatever the adaptation is that you care about. And let's just talk about it from a performance aspect. You get better. But recovery is different, right? And it isn't clear to me how, you have one person who's resistance trained for, all else being equal, one person 5 years, one person 10. Why would the additional 5 years of training experience mean that they recover better? Now, perform better, I get, but why would they be able to do more working sets per week? And I think Mike and I actually agree on that, because that's what I said was, why would that improve? Overwhelmingly, it seems to vary between individuals, and then the individual has whatever their possible range is, and then they can manipulate that with both up and down, with sleep, more or less food, things like this. But again, using myself as the example, I've really come to realize that I have low normal recovery abilities. Like, I just can't, I simply am not able to do. Now, I use fairly high frequency, but let's say, like, one thing I've actually seen is 24 working sets a week. This is a recommendation that I've seen folks in the evidence-based community use for some body parts. And my thought has been, yeah, I could see some people who could do that, but me, it would just be like, I'm dead. And I don't see that as something where I just need to eat more, I just need to sleep more. It's like, even if I sleep as much as is beneficial, eat as much as is beneficial, I fundamentally can't do that. And if anything, and we talked about this previously, I think if we talk about maximum recoverable volume in terms of number of working sets per body part per week, I could actually see that going down as a result of this. You get stronger, sets are heavier, they're more taxing, and you're also better you're better able to perform the movements
and inflict damage.
So they're more, both within a session, they're more muscularly fatiguing. And like you said, in terms of the actual stimulus and the damage that results, it could be additional. So, and that, now that I think about it, that's actually a trend I've just anecdotally, I've seen it more than once. You have the novice who just does tons and tons and tons, but it's largely ineffective or inefficient, improperly performed. And then you could take that person and then have them do just improved technique or whatever it might be, and then suddenly 4 sets, it's like, that's really hard.
Yeah.
So I don't recall what the question was, but I hope that was valuable.
Yeah, for sure. No, it was just elucidating the fact that, maximum recoverable volume is just a concept to ensure that we don't overtrain in essence. And it's something that guides how we manage our volume over time.
Yeah, I think that's my understanding as well. It started out as don't do more than what you can recover from. And something I want to say on this topic that's somewhat of an aside is I think some genuinely bad ideas have come out of MRV, but I think that's overwhelmingly not Mike's responsibility. An example is the fact that it began as you shouldn't do more than you can recover from. I see almost no one talk about that. If I recall correctly, because I watched the presentation, where Mike first talked about this, if I recall correctly, the first 20 minutes or something was almost exclusively relating to not doing more than you recover from. And he strongly emphasized that. And what it's been translated into, or the part that is remembered, is, oh, do as much as you can recover, do more, make better gains.
Yeah.
And I think it's something to keep in mind. I haven't seen anything that would cause me to go as far as to say, I think Mike made a mistake in the way he's articulated it or something. But it speaks to the fact that you need to be cognizant of, what you say, and then also how it's perceived, and then you have to respond to that, because it seems to have been
misinterpretation to a degree,
or very simplified by some people to mean something like just do a shitload of volume.
Yeah,
which is different than
it's very different,
right?
For sure. So volume, we could continue to talk about, but I do feel we're going to keep going in circles as we somewhat have been. But I think it's been very beneficial in discussing the myriad of ways that it applies to a number of different situations. But let's talk about how intensity influences hypertrophy. So something that we've spoken about before, and a mistake that I see, and I definitely made this myself initially, was lifting too heavy all the time, and thinking that the only way that we get bigger in the gym is by adding weight to the bar, which is obviously an oversimplified form of progressive overload. So let's talk about how intensity influences bodybuilding and muscle growth.
Sure. So I would start by acknowledging that I think there are plausible, unique benefits to heavier training, and there's a question of how that's defined. But with the primary one being maximal motor unit recruitment, and there seems to be an issue now of, and I would acknowledge again that this is on the edge of my knowledge, but I think I'm not sure if it was just Andrew Vygotsky, but Andrew Vygotsky and potentially others wrote a letter to the editor recently relating to EMG, but talking about it seems the issue with motor unit recruitment and light loads is that of maximal concurrent motor unit recruitment. So it seems that what we're looking at is you can maximize motor unit recruitment with light loads, but you don't recruit all of them at the same time. And that would be a unique benefit of heavy training, because there's assuming the load is sufficiently heavy that you can't get around it.
Yeah.
Now, I think so that would be a theoretical reason or argument for the inclusion of genuinely heavy training, even in hypertrophy training.
Yeah.
Now, interestingly, what we have a decent amount of now that we didn't have, say, 10 years ago is well-designed applied research, which shows that given the equation of volume, I really wonder if that's grammatically correct, but assuming volume is equated, you generate similar hypertrophy with heavy training and moderately heavy training, and moderately heavy training and light training. So being defined as sets of 3, sets of 4 to 6, sets of 8 to 12, and then right. In fact, I think the best light load study I've seen, it was something like the actual reps being performed per set were more like 30. And again, what we see is similar hypertrophy with assuming volume is equated. And so this suggests that, I might go as far as to say this demonstrates that it isn't as simple as heavy training or you're wasting your time.
There's many ways to skin the proverbial cat.
Right. So I think that a traditional view has been heavy training is for strength, moderately heavy training, again, meaning 8 to 12 reps, that's hypertrophy, and then more than that is muscular endurance. And very early on, that's what I thought. I thought high rep stuff doesn't build muscle. And so to actually use percentages, what one traditionally has seen is 60 or 65% of a 1 rep max being the cutoff. Below that, it just doesn't do it, but it doesn't effectively stimulate hypertrophy. And I think the lowest we've seen now that's actually generated substantial hypertrophy is 30% of a 1 rep max, which is very radically less.
And that's correlated directly to motor unit recruitment and effort.
Now, see, you have,
because that's a big caveat to
you have
this.
You have to piece together different research to answer a question like that. So I'm specifically thinking of the applied research where the people just do it and then they look at changes in muscle size. And again, the with regard to motor unit recruitment, again, as a non-expert in this area, it appears that the change that has occurred is the initial view was you get maximal motor unit recruitment with heavy training. You don't get it with light training. Oh, wait, it seems that we get it with light training. Oh, wait, it seems that we get it, but it isn't concurrent.
Yeah.
So all motor units at some point are active, but they are recruited. Some are recruited and then not. Others become recruited, etc. So you might get full motor unit recruitment in the sense that all are recruited throughout a long set with a light load when fatigue is very high. And again, the difference would be that with heavy training, you could get that from the first rep you do of a heavy set.
Yeah.
So again, they're kind of the two sides of this, of the theoretical side and then the practical side, and both really are being addressed by the research.
It really comes down, from all of this discussion on these, many ways to achieve hypertrophy, to personal preference, as well as, the type of training stimulus that you not only prefer, but you're motivated to do. For example, I know a lot of, really good bodybuilders who just don't have the mental grit to lift heavy 3s and 5s, but they can rep out, 12s, 15s. Whereas conversely, you have these, athletes who would hate the thought of an 8 rep or plus set, but are more than happy to go balls to wall for 3 to 5 reps. I think that, has to some degree, play a large part in how you devise your program.
Definitely. And I think a reasonable analysis that would build off of what you just said would be, given it seems volume is very, very, very important. And that, again, you equate volume, you get similar outcomes, not identical, but similar, that if someone just really loves heavy training or moderately heavy training or even light training, that's what they should do. And they should just accumulate as much volume as they can with that which they prefer. Now, there are other things to consider here. I was thinking about this prior to us having this chat. If we ask the question, why would one not just do heavy training or do a lot of heavy training? Similarly, why would one not just do light training or a lot of it? The answer for heavy training is it's disproportionately fatiguing, and it goes further than that. It's given the same volume, it's more fatiguing, more likely to cause injury.
For sure.
And we look at Schoenfeld et al. 2014, the quote powerlifting versus bodybuilding study. One of the things I always come back to, it was one of the most striking results from that study is
drop off rate. Yeah.
Well, that was part of it. Also the length of the sessions.
Yes.
If I
90 versus 30, was it?
I'm pretty sure. See, for a long time I thought it was 90 and 17, and then I seem to recall going back and rereading the study and not seeing that. And then I think that might have been a study where Andrew Rogotsky was one of the research assistants helping and running it, and I had asked him about it, but it was a very significant difference. I mean, huge difference.
Time allotment to lifting heavy weights is way more increased than what it is for lighter loads. And a brilliant point in that the exercises you have to use to lift heavy just induce a hell of a lot more systemic fatigue, which has its own set of, implications to achieving volume. So again, we come full circle to this whole exercise selection, discussion that we had at the start of the video when we talk about, intensity. It's
right. And, it's funny, if someone's bias is toward the science and theory and thinking about physiology and so on, which traditionally has probably been where I am, one could say, yeah, kind of who gives a shit, like volume is the same. It works the same. Yeah, different time, whatever. But that's huge. I mean, in terms of what we recommend people do and what they do, if we're talking about it taking 2 or 3 times as long to accumulate the same volume for the same result, it's like, are you kidding? That is, again, that I probably said before that was the most significant result of that study.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, obviously, it's very significant that they showed that, volume equation produced essentially the same hypertrophy. But then once we move past that difference was striking. And the difference in injuries, I think 2 subjects in the heavy group had to drop out because of injuries. No one in the 3x10 group. And then by the end of the study, the people doing exclusively heavy training were burned out, and those who had been doing exclusively moderately heavy training wanted to do more. So, and then going back to the high rep work, the study that was done by Schoenfeld and colleagues was published either last year or the year prior, but I'll say the high rep versus low rep study, again, I think it's the best designed study I've seen that's investigated that. It was noted that many of the subjects in the high rep group threw up during training because it was just so hard. So whereas we can say of heavy training, it's disproportionately fatiguing, it takes longer, higher risk of injury. With light training, we would then say it's disproportionately difficult. You can literally produce the same or similar hypertrophy working less hard. And while I wouldn't want to say you shouldn't work hard or hard work doesn't pay off, it's a difference of, we're talking about superfluous hard work in that case.
Yeah.
Or you could not train super light, work just as hard, but rack up more volume in the moderate rep range and make better gains.
Yeah. And this discussion is so important, I think, for people to, just understand the complexity at which, hypertrophy takes place, because it isn't as simple as what people think. But in saying that, I'd like to talk about the practical applications that people can take away from listening to the podcast today, so they can go, wow, I've learned all the different, levels and intricacies within hypertrophy on a, theoretical level, but what the fuck does that mean? How do I, do anything in my training? So let's talk about that. So specificity for bodybuilders and progressively overloading their program would mean that the adaptations they want to make are hypertrophy, which ultimately means they need to increase volume. So when we need to increase volume within a training program, let's talk about a 6, 12, 10-week training block. What are some practical ways we can progressively overload our volume to see that adaptation that bodybuilders want, hypertrophy?
Absolutely. Would you object to me answering this more theoretically? Because I think it has important implications for the practical side.
100%. Go for it.
Sure. So this is a statement which may sound very obviously true and thus, condescending, like, why is he saying this? But bodybuilders train for hypertrophy. Getting better in the gym simply isn't the goal. So I perceive some people as placing too much emphasis on getting better in the gym, which isn't to say it isn't important, you don't need to get better, etc. But I do think people should keep their eye on the prize of what we're trying to do is stimulate the muscle. Like, you go in, you open the anabolic window, you create that stimulus that wouldn't be there otherwise, and then you use nutritional interventions to augment that adaptation. So So why even, care about progressive overload? What is the role of it? The role is, if you train for hypertrophy in a manner which actually results in hypertrophy, so if your training is effective, your muscles will get bigger by definition. And this gets to this controversy of the role or the relationship between muscle size and strength. I would say that it appears to me physically impossible for a muscle to get larger and not be stronger. And I think we also have to account for skill, and it isn't as simple as an individual muscle's size and strength. We need to talk about the skill of the individual with a lift, but assuming that remains at least the same, and it will actually improve over time, but assuming it stays at least the same and muscle size increases, this means you're stronger. So we need to institute progressive overload for hypertrophy, because over time you will get stronger and you will need to use more weight to generate a similar hypertrophic stimulus.
Yeah.
And that's still going to diminish just because of diminishing marginal returns over time. You simply can't continue making the progress at the same rate. So that's fundamentally the role of progressive overload. And in practice, what I most often use is simply double progression. So you have an exercise, you have a specified rep range and number of sets, and then you start with a given weight at the bottom of a rep range. You work up through the rep range. Additionally, you want to account for intensity in the sense of RPE. So you have the exercise sets, assigned rep range, RPE, start typically bottom of the rep range with a given weight. RPE is where you want it to be. Work up through the rep range. RPE is still where you want it to be, and then bump up by the lowest standard increment. Now that is one progression scheme, and there are many. They can be appropriate in different contexts, but that's the one where it works poorly less often than other progression schemes in my experience. Now, another one I would mention, because
just on that, Ian, sorry, just to interrupt, just on that, I've found personally with myself and clients, the double progression works extremely well for more accessory type movements, machines, isolation work, when compared to the heavier stuff in big compound movements such as squats, deadlifts, barbell bench press. Even though it does have its application there, do you agree that it works favorably for smaller muscle groups as well as those accessory movements?
Interestingly, I thought you were going to say exactly the opposite. I thought you were going to say it works better for bigger exercises and less well for smaller. And are we still connected?
I'm there. I'm here.
Gotcha. So I think it might be helpful to back up a little bit and say that the bigger the exercise, the more aggressive one is able to be with progression and sustain that. I mean, whatever it might be, you might be able to be aggressive in the short term, but it's a question of, is this something that you're going to be able to do over time? So on one end of the spectrum, we might have, honestly, barbell hip thrusts might be the exercise on which most people are able to be most aggressive, maybe even more than deadlifts. It would probably be between one of those two. And then other end of the continuum would be something like a lateral raise. Yeah. So certainly with regard to what you said, when it comes to something like a squat, there are many cases in which you can and it will be appropriate to be more aggressive than double progression, because double progression means it's designed to yield slow, steady progress. Something I would note about double progression, though, is you can create variants of it based on the exercise. So I mentioned you have the number of sets, the rep range. You can tighten the rep range, which accelerates the frequency with which you have to add load. Yeah. That's something which I have done for something like a squat. Similarly, I'll sometimes broaden the rep range. You can also literally change the progression, meaning first workout, it's 2 sets of 4. And then instead of the next workout being 1 set of 4 and 1 set of 5, it could be 2 sets of 5. Or you could accelerate it more than that. 2 sets of 4, 2 sets of 6. It's highly context dependent.
Yeah, for sure.
But there's, again, at the risk of stating the obvious, there are definitely going to be cases where you will want progression to be something like start with the following percentage and add this amount per week or every second session. I don't want context to be the fallback for me, that like it's the non-answer. Dude, how do I get big muscles? It depends. Well, that's technically true, but it doesn't do anything to help the person. But at the same time, it depends.
Yeah, for sure. There's so many ways that you can progressively overload for hypertrophy. Even as simple as adding a set, before adding a set or two to an exercise before you deload, knowing that that's going to be the deal breaker and really overreach before you pull it back and super compensate. But aside from the double progression, what other plausible strategies can you employ to progressively overload a program in a practical sense, such as exercises, progressing those in and of themselves, for example, range of motion, time under tension? What else do you use in your program design, or is it simply just a matter of keeping it simple, stupid, and double progression?
Right. So Brett Contreras actually, I don't know where or when he did this, but someone posted it on something I had said and compiled a list of, about 20 different means of progression. Things like,
workout density, rest.
Yeah, like all else remains the same. You rest less between sets, etc. So in talking about double progression, the assumption is that everything else remains the same. So It's really interesting you mentioned range of motion. I think it makes for a valuable line of discussion of the reason why I wouldn't generally use range of motion as a means of progression is because I think people should use a full range of motion
from the start,
right?
Correct. Yeah.
So it's like, on the one hand, let's say you're working with someone and they heard this, that, or the other bodybuilder, they read it in a magazine, like partial range of motion, constant tension. So they're benching 225 pounds for 10 reps, but it's half a range of motion. If later on that person is doing 225 for 10 reps with a full range of motion, they've made progress,
Correct.
Even though they're using the same weight, doing the same reps. The volume in terms of sets, reps, load is the same, which, by the way, speaks to a weakness of volume. But however, once that person is using a full range of motion, that's no longer a variable unless it then degrades again, which you wouldn't want to do. So, and similarly, things like
you
rest
see this
times.
quite a lot, don't you? Because I know I certainly do. I have lifters who come in and we'll do a screening and I'll say, show me your bench press, and there's partial range. And like same with the squat, even just simple things like incorrect technique, for example, loading through anterior pelvic tilt on the squat. As soon as you correct these things, all of a sudden the pool of muscle fibers is stimulated so much more, and that causes progress. That's progressive overload. And I think, before you go on to what you're about to say, we need to emphasize the importance of technique in all of this and actually stimulating the muscles properly, first and foremost, before adding more sets, reps, load, and all the rest of it.
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly important point. And I'll go two different ways with this. With regard to squats, great example of, I have seen this many, many times. The person who they put 5 plates aside on the bar, they get out and they squat in the sense of they lower themselves 4 to 6 inches and return to the top. Now, in some sense, that's impressive. I mean, they are still physically supporting 495 pounds, but what does that tell us about how much they would be able to squat to depth? And it might actually be like, they might genuinely be, well, let's put it this way. That person might be able to make their quads grow by squatting 225 to depth. And obviously this is a hypothetical, but it seems to me very plausible. Like, they're using a ton of weight, but the range of motion is super restricted, and they perform the same exercise, but the form is so radically different. Yeah, and so if they're doing 495, barely moving it for 10, 225 for 10 to depth might represent progress.
Yeah.
Another really, to give a really strange example, I think altering force sharing might even be able to reasonably regard that as progress.
I quoted you just earlier on social media. The deliberate manipulation and distribution of load to a target muscle is what you said to me in a previous discussion.
Right. And so I guess the place to start is, I do think one is able to consciously manipulate that to some extent. I think the closer you get to a 1 rep max on anything, the harder that's going to become. I mean,
sure. You're more concerned about getting the weight up and not failing the rep than you are actually contracting and squeezing. Yeah.
I mean, I'll go even further than that and say that I suspect there's a point at which you can't do anything of significance because the weight is just so, like, the weight is going to force the body to do what it's going to do to still move that load. But if it's something like a moderately heavy pull down, I think that's something that you can manipulate. And what's really interesting is, technique might look exactly the same. Range of motion might look exactly the same. Load is exactly the same, and so on. So I would totally acknowledge that this would be a very, if not difficult, if not impossible thing. Probably realistic, impossible to measure in practice, but I think it's probably a real phenomenon. So this is just an unusual example to underline the point of, it's a lot more than just increasing load, just increasing reps, and so on.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And that's something that I think not a lot of people discuss enough is, the progress that you make in terms of your ability to contract a muscle. And then that opens up the realm of, being injured, having tightness, weaknesses, imbalances, which, cause the, signaling of, the muscles and their contraction to be in such a disarray that some people just cannot contract their muscles properly, even with, simple exercises. And that is a form of progression. If you can, treat all those issues to then be able to contract the muscle better, I think that's just as important as adding sets and reps.
Yeah, I think this quickly gets into a discussion of injuries where I have no special knowledge and I'm cognizant of that, so I wouldn't want to speak to it and get everything wrong, and potentially mislead people. I would say one thing I want to note here, and this isn't intended as a criticism of you or anything you just said, but it's something which came to mind and I think should be noted, is I do think there's a real risk of going too far with this. So,
100%.
And this has been fairly extensively debated online. I've seen, folks in the evidence-based community talking about it because there's a lot coming out of, Ben Pakulski talks a lot about intention. It's one of the fundamental components of his training style, and so I do think there's a risk of such a thing as, someone is used to doing pull downs with 200 pounds with sloppy form. If that person then does pull downs with, let's say, 140 with much better form, okay, I think that's better. I think that's safer. I think it's arguably more effective. You might need, like, in order to justify that substantively, you might need EMG work, something like this. But what if that person goes from, what if we're talking about 140 with good form to 70 with super ultra mega using 7 Qs kind of thing?
Mm.
I do, it's one of those things where if I had to bet, I would bet there will come a point that you've taken it too far. I think this is something I've done in the past. And I think you want to strike a balance between, for hypertrophy purposes, you want to strike a balance between ensuring you're feeling the targeted muscle work, etc. But also just to some extent, just fucking lifting the weight.
For sure. There's 100%. You don't want to become a librarian at the expense of being somebody who's meant to be lifting weights.
Right.
And but it just comes down to that point. You need to be able to contract and feel the muscle to then be able to do the things that we're talking about. But something that I wanted to, finish this discussion up on, because we talk about progressive overload and we talk about, adding sets and all the rest of it and hypertrophy in a theoretical sense. But what is forgotten is what actually drives muscle growth is what occurs outside of the gym in the other, hours of the day, which is our recovery. So can we talk about the, specific strategies that people can implement and bodybuilders can use to maximize their recovery?
Yes. I would first like to note that I actually don't think I agree that the primary driver of muscle growth is that which occurs out of the gym. What
it augments,
Eric Helms,
it adds to what we do.
Exactly. Yes. Perfect. So something, and I just wanted to note that because I think, sometimes you see like it's 70% nutrition, 30% training, and percentages like this. And
that use of the term primary driver was simply a function of 3 hours sleep and the second podcast today, Ian. I apologize. Augment.
Okay, no worries. I again, I don't, whenever I say anything like that, I don't intend it as a critique of you.
It's good. You have to be critical of these things. It's good.
Because I do think it's a fairly popular view that like training just does a little stimulus and then you lay a bunch of protein on it and that makes you freaking jacked. The reality is there was a study which came out fairly recently. Man, I wish I remember the authors, but the addition of a protein supplement was beneficial, but probably a whole lot less than a lot of people would think. So the primary driver is training, and then nutrition is. Eric Helms said something on this topic, which was, phrased in a way that only Eric could have said it, but I can't remember what the quote was. But it was something to the effect that, training is the primary driver, and nutrition simply allows the maximum adaptation. Yeah, it was much better than that. But again, it's additive as opposed to the other way around. So with regard to recovery, immediate thought: sleep. So more than 3 hours, right? And here's the thing about sleep, and I can genuinely be brief on this topic. Everyone, it seems to me, practically everyone, talks about how awesome sleep is, and then they don't get enough sleep. And it's just, stop it. It's just fucking like, it's like, why? Like what? Like how can you simultaneously? Well, I know how. I mean, one can hold a belief and then not act consistently with it. Like everyone can do that. But
do as I say, not as I do, so to speak.
I had someone message me and my intention isn't to just slam this person, but they asked me about a particular supplement and, to compare it to the EC stack. And I was kind of trying to get a sense of why they're doing it. And they mentioned they've been using the EC stack to stay up really late to study, but that they get to a point where they're like wide awake, but they can't focus. And they're wondering if this supplement would help them. My response was, it sounds like you're sleep deprived.
Yeah.
Like, and so there's always the, like, if someone's like medical student in residency or whatever, and they literally don't have a choice, I get it. But oftentimes it's like, oh yeah, I sleep, 6 hours a night because I train and have a job and I'm a student. And the thing that directly impinges on the sleep is the studying. And I genuinely think in many, many cases, people would there's actually research on this. I know of at least one study where subjects were sleep deprived and then made to do work. And some subjects got 8 hours of sleep a night and some got 6. The amount of work done was the same because those who were sleep deprived were less effective when they were awake.
Yeah.
And that tracks, I think, very well with practically anyone's experience. So, figure out, certainly there are the people who get away with less, but don't base your behavior on what the outlier is able to do.
Yeah.
And so again, sleep is huge. Get as much high quality sleep as you can, assuming you benefit.
Nutrition will be a discussion for another day, but in a nutshell, super critical.
Sufficient energy, sufficient protein.
Yeah. Boom.
Those
Supplements?
are huge.
Creatine?
Yeah, my immediate thought was my immediate thought was that I wouldn't have brought them up, but yeah, I would say creatine, yes. From a recovery aspect, I mean, you can get into stuff like L-carnitine, L-tartrate improves recovery. Citrulline malate has been shown in one study to decrease soreness by 40%, which I think can be really significant. Other good examples aren't coming to mind. I mean, they exist, but you have to consider the
big rocks as opposed
to
relative.
Yeah. I mean, like the huge ones, honestly, are going to be sleep,
nutrition,
sleep amount and quality, energy intake relative to expenditure, protein intake, high quality protein intake.
Perfect. And you spoke about reducing soreness and how that can obviously be beneficial for training and whatnot. Do you see a place for, this is a little bit left of center of our discussion, but active recovery, provided that active recovery is compensated with additional energy, do you see a place for active recovery in a bodybuilding protocol if it improves soreness?
Yes, but I'm really skeptical of it actually helping with this, which is not the same as me saying that it doesn't help, but things like foam rolling, it's
even walking.
Frankly, I just don't even believe the muscle adhesions thing. So my view on that is basically, if it makes you feel better, that's a good enough reason. But that's what I say practically.
And do you think that's a placebo effect to a large degree?
I think it is. I think it's probably a lot to do with what's called the meaning response. If you are absolutely convinced, if you genuinely believe that foam rolling, whatever it might be, I just use foam rolling as an example, that doing particular stretching and so on is going to make you less sore, you're going to feel better, and then I think it will genuinely have that effect physiologically somehow. And I say that because we see responses like that, like in scientific research, using all weird outcomes like brand names on placebo pills make a difference and all this. But yeah, from a physiological perspective, I'm really skeptical, and I think something like increasing your training frequency is, if someone's like, "Oh, I'm sore," I hear this a lot. My immediate response is increase your training frequency. Yeah. It's like once
those recovery light sessions, performing the particular movement and spreading the volume like that, play massive dividends in terms of your recovery, as well as keeping your volume to a point where it's doing much less damage in a single bout, so to speak.
Right, and I realize we're going to want to finish here, but I'll just say that I have dropped everything that I didn't do a ton to begin with, but the lacrosse ball stuff and all, completely stopped doing it after having a discussion with Andrew about this maybe 2 years ago now. He's the person who articulated to me the muscular adhesions theory doesn't seem to be intelligible. And so I completely stopped all of that, and I actually feel much better. Like the adhesions that I thought I had are just gone. So at this point, I certainly do warm up. Like warm up is a different category. I do warm up stuff. I do activation stuff. I think there's some scientific evidence that that's probably beneficial. But then when it comes to, stuff outside the gym with the intent of improving recovery, in a weird way, I would say that in terms of things like soreness, more training, meaning more frequency, would do that. Mm. And I would rather direct that, that time toward more sleep, more food, and so on. But again, if it makes someone feel better, and I would, if it's something like low intensity cardio, if it just improves your mood, that's a good enough reason to do it.
Yeah, for sure. And the final thing on all of this, because I don't think we can talk about progressive overload without talking about a deload, because it's just as important having those lighter weights to then super compensate and allow for all that hard training to come to fruition, so to speak. So in terms of a deload, how do you incorporate them? How frequent? When? Why? Talk to us, Ian.
I don't.
You don't deload?
And here's why. Because muscle growth is a local process. So I'm really skeptical. Like, I totally get, here's my general view on sports. I wasn't raised watching them and being really engaged in them. I mean, I played soccer, but I know very little about them. So when other people talk to me about sports with confidence, I'm like, okay, cool. That's your area. So when people talk about, the great value of periodization for athletes, whatever the particular sport might be, certainly with strength training, I don't object to or disagree with that remotely. Hypertrophy is a different animal because, again, it's a local process. This brings us right back around to, how do you get bigger biceps? Do things which increase muscle protein synthesis in your biceps and mitigate muscle protein breakdown and do that for a long time and your biceps get bigger. So certainly if someone designs a program such that volume accumulates and surpasses that which you're able to recover from, and you accumulate fatigue, you can't just do that indefinitely. At some point, you can't perform in the same way. I mean, it's physically impossible. But the idea of super compensation, I'll put it, I want to be wary to not make, claims of this doesn't happen, when there's a big difference between it's not clear something happens and maybe we get evidence later. But it just isn't clear to me how
that applies
starting out a training block with low volume and then moderate volume and then overreach and then deload and then start at a low volume again. It isn't clear to me how that it makes sense at the whole body level of you accumulate fatigue and then you need the deload, but it really isn't clear to me how you get a super compensatory local hypertrophic response to that. And my view is basically this. I think if I had to bet, I would bet that the person who designs a program such that it's sustainable. So we're not thinking about MRV here. We're thinking about an effective level of volume from which that they can consistently do. So we're talking about work capacity there, and then recover from and we're talking about recovery capacity there. And they're able to make incremental progress over time in the gym. So that's where stuff like, that's why it's a big reason why I take double progression so much.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I would bet that person would make very similar hypertrophic progress to the person who starts off low volume, then scales it up again, overreaches and deloads. And I would point out, by the way, let's assume that the person who does the more aggressively periodized approach, within some part of that 12-week period, they make better progress. Well, remember that during the deload, the person who doesn't have scheduled deloads continues with similar training volume, so they're doing more. They're also doing more than the person when they have the introductory 4 weeks or whatever it might be. And then in the middle part of the block, it's probably similar, and then the other person is going to go and overreach.
It's almost like this back and forth, almost circle jerk when you're doing a scheme like that. It's interesting that you bring that up.
I mean, just think about it this way. The increase in the deload concept, it's like 1 + 2 + 3 plus, let's say, 0 for the deload. I realize it's more complex than this, by the way. 1 + 2 + 3 + 0. Okay, so it's 6. The other person does 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus, and it just, so the long-term progress, now, given the actual scenario I gave, the person who's consistent does better, and I wouldn't bet on that in practice. But the point is that it isn't clear to me that this very...
They are necessary.
Yeah, I mean, they're necessary if you've accumulated fatigue in a way where you can't just keep going.
Yeah.
Certainly.
But if you're programming and you're not overreaching and reaching MRV and hitting that ceiling, they're almost, redundant, so to speak.
Although I would acknowledge that on a micro scale, I use this. So I get it in principle. Again, I would acknowledge if you're accumulating fatigue,
you have your light weights within your training block, correct? Your light weights. Yeah,
exactly. And so that's one.
That's how you mitigate that on a long-term scale.
That is one way, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, like on a very simple level, it's don't have someone do more frequency than they can recover from. Don't have someone do more volume than they can recover from on whatever the time scale is. Which, by the way, on a macro time scale, someone like Mike Israetel would agree with that. I mean, he isn't going to say over 16 weeks do more volume than you can recover from. But yeah, I would think more in terms of a training week, and so totally I could / have and do and will have people have harder workouts where if that was every single workout, well, 3 weeks or 3 days into a training week, they'd be destroyed.
Yeah.
But I think, one of the great advantages of hypertrophy training is that it's local. And by the way, I don't mean to say that that there's absolutely no whole body as if your biceps are over here and there's no influence of the remainder of the body or something like this. But again, it's
there's much less neural fatigue, joint fatigue than strength training and training for performance per se.
Right. The outcome for which we are training is hypertrophy of particular muscles, it isn't how much can this whole body pull off the floor. So it's different in that sense, and I think that's advantageous in that, again, you can literally have a day where all of the work you do is like sets of 15. Now I don't think I've ever advised that, but so yeah, you could have, again, within a training week, you could have much harder, more aggressive, heavier, more progressive overload type. Mike Israetel would probably use the term, overloading sessions, and you can have sessions where it's like burnout stuff, and that still stimulates hypertrophy. We know that pretty much beyond a reasonable doubt at this point.
Yeah, that's again brings me back to this higher level discussion of individual preference and the personal psyche behind what that individual is going to enjoy and looking for in their training. And it just brought to my mind your entire philosophy is lifting for life, and that just resonates through your progression models and through everything that you do, which I think is fantastic, because that's how you're going to get as big as possible, is doing it for a long fucking time. And conversely, a model where you jack it up, pull it down, jack it up, pull it down, it's far more aggressive, but that could work well for someone who's like, hey, I just want to do bodybuilding for the next couple of years because then I want to get married and have kids and I'll never, compete as a bodybuilder again. I think it's just interesting how, there's so many ways to program. It's so individual dependent, and it goes far beyond the physiological, individual differences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would acknowledge that I'm trying to think of how best to phrase this. I could see it being the case that someone who really aggressively scales volume up and down like this makes better gains in whatever the period might be. I'm more skeptical of the long-term gains.
Yeah.
And someone might say, well, if they make better gains in the short term, can we scale that out? I think it depends. So to look at it on a smaller scale, I mean, yes, if right now for the next 4 weeks, I continue doing what I do, and then someone else is a lot more aggressive with it, and we look at muscle size now, and then we'll probably, there's a question of whether or not we would even be able to discern a difference. But if we could, I think we would discern a better one there. But if that person isn't able to sustain it, then there's going to be a period in which they have to pull back, and I don't. So, and another thing I wanted to mention, because this, I've been thinking about it recently, and in wanting to maybe give, the phrase that comes to mind is want to give an argument more actively against that periodization approach. If the results are plausibly the same and one programming option is drastically simpler, then that would be a reason to favor the simpler option. And I would note, by the way, I could understand someone being skeptical of this. This is what I've done for a long, long time, and it's been successful for me. And I've also, there was one gentleman who ran a program. It was a generic program I had designed, so not for him specifically. He ran it for an entire year and was very successful. And then there was a client of mine who everything was very extensively customized for him, but I'm not sure we had a deload at all in a 9-month period. Maybe one, and again, it worked really well because
I think deloading for the sake of deloading is a very frivolous endeavor. I think you really need to make sure that it's for good reason, as opposed to the just straight out model of deload every 6 weeks.
Absolutely. So my position would not be one of don't deload. It would be deload if it's required, and people program in a way which requires that. I would say for hypertrophy, what I'm fundamentally questioning here is not deloads. I'm not saying no one should. Again, I'm not saying no one should deload. I've deloaded, but I question the position that what seemed to me to be very powerlifting influenced periodization models are necessary to maximize long-term progress for bodybuilders. Yeah,
there's a big difference between powerlifters and bodybuilders, and the recovery is definitely one of those. I think that's a fantastic place to wrap up, Ian. It's been a brilliant 90-minute discussion. I think the listeners will get a hell of a lot out of it, especially on both the theoretical sense as well as what they can do practically. So, guys, that was our first episode for Muscle by Brain, and we'll be back next week with episode 2, so stay tuned. Thank you very much, Ian, and we'll see you guys next time.
I look forward to it. Thanks so much.